You know, from the moment we're born, there's this one idea that's hammered into us. Family is everything, right? It's our rock, our safety net, the one bond that's supposed to be unbreakable. But what happens when that very bond is the source of your pain?
So what's happening right now, kind of under the surface, is this silent epidemic. It's family estrangement, and it's one of the last big taboos in our society. We're talking about adult children making the incredibly painful decision to cut ties. And to everyone on the outside, it can look sudden, ungrateful, maybe even like an act of rebellion.
But here's the thing. Behind that silence, it's almost never a simple story of just anger. What's really there is a profound, incredibly complex psychology of survival. So let's try to move past judgment for a bit and really dig into the reasons a person might make that desperate decision to walk away.
Okay, so first things first, let's just bust the biggest myth right out of the gate. The idea that estrangement is some sudden explosion. It almost never is. A better way to think about it is like a volcano. The pressure builds silently, year after year, completely hidden from anyone on the surface.
Think about it. A volcano only looks sudden to the people who weren't paying attention to the tremors, right? That big fight over the holidays? That one really hurtful comment? That's not the reason. That's just the final trigger. The moment all that internal pressure finally becomes too much to bear after years and years of being ignored.
All right, so if it's not this big, sudden explosion, what is it really? Well, estrangement actually begins with a slow, quiet erosion. It's this wearing down that's practically invisible to everyone except for the person who's living through it. And this is where things get really wild. This contrast between what the world sees and what's actually happening on the inside. On the surface, you've got the happy family photos, the holiday get-togethers, what looks like a totally normal relationship. But internally, that person is dealing with chronic anxiety before every phone call, constantly rehearsing conversations in their head, and literally shrinking parts of who they are just to keep the peace.
There's actually a term for this. Psychologists call it microtrauma. And no, we're not talking about one huge, terrible event. We're talking about the little things, the subtle criticisms that are disguised as just being concerned, the boundaries that get pushed just a tiny bit further every single time, the dismissive tone that screams your feelings don't matter. Each one on its own seems small, but when you add them all up, they create this toxic climate that just slowly eats away at a person's sense of self.
This is so important to understand. Before the anger, before the final break, comes the exhaustion. The real starting point for this whole journey isn't anger. It's just complete and utter depletion. A person simply runs out of room. They run out of energy and hope to keep taking on the same wounds over and over again.
Now let's get into something that happens way before anyone even thinks about leaving. It's this idea that in some families, you don't really get to discover who you are, you get assigned a role. And you'll see these 4 roles pop up again and again in these systems. You've got the golden child, who has to give up who they really are to get praise, the scapegoat, who basically soaks up all the family's problems and often gets punished for being the one to speak the truth. Then there's the invisible child, who figures out that the only way to survive is to be quiet and small, and the parentified child, the one who has to act as the emotional parent to their own parents, learning that love is something you have to earn.
See, none of these roles, not a single one, lets a person just be themselves. So when someone finally walks away, it's often not about rejecting the people in their family. It's a desperate attempt to escape the role they were forced into so they can finally figure out who they actually are underneath it all.
So this begs a really tough question, right? If it was so bad, why on earth did they stay for so long? Why put up with years, sometimes even decades, of this kind of pain? Well, the answer comes down to some really powerful psychological forces. One of the biggest reasons is something called trauma bonding. And it's tricky. It's what happens when you have these moments of real harm mixed in with moments of warmth. You know, a really nasty comment followed by a rare apology, a long cold silence followed by a bit of affection. Your nervous system gets hooked on this inconsistency, and you start to think that if you just try harder, you can get the good version of that person to come back. It's this perfect metaphor. People call it the empty well. You keep going back to it, thinking, hoping that this time there will be water. This time you'll get the love, the support, the understanding you need. But every single time the bucket comes up dry. And eventually, going back to that empty well just becomes another way of abandoning yourself.
And that's when the final decision often gets made. It comes from this one absolutely gut-wrenching realization. This cycle isn't going to change. And if I stay, I am going to disappear completely, one little piece at a time, until there's nothing left of me. Okay, let's talk about no contact. When most people hear that phrase, they immediately think it's about revenge or punishment or being mean. But honestly, it's almost never about that. It's a strategy, a survival strategy.
And it's not like flicking a switch either. It usually happens in stages. First, maybe there's low contact. You shorten visits, keep conversations on the surface. Then, some people try what's called the gray rock method. You become so neutral and boring that you don't give the conflict any fuel. And it's only when all of those softer boundaries are ignored time and time again that no contact becomes the last necessary tool in the toolbox.
So distance isn't rejection, it's clarity. It's that moment where you just have to say, look, I can't change you, but I can protect myself. It's about taking back your own mental health, and for so many people, it's the very first time in their lives that they actually feel safe.
But what happens next? Choosing to create that distance? Well, that's not the end of the story, not by a long shot. In a lot of ways, it's the beginning of a whole new journey, a long, complicated journey of healing. Let's talk about what life can look like after the silence.
And one of the toughest parts of that journey is this really unique type of grief. It's called ambiguous loss. Basically, you're mourning someone who's still alive, but they're completely unreachable emotionally. There's no funeral, no final closure. You're grieving the relationship you had, sure, but maybe even more painfully, you're grieving the one you always dreamed of, but never got. But here's the beautiful part. Right in the middle of all that pain, healing can start. And a huge piece of that is discovering what's called a family of choice. Your family of origin might have been about obligation, about conditional love, but a family of choice, these are the friends, the partners, the mentors. It's built on mutual respect, on chosen connections, on a safety that you create for yourself.
Ultimately, healing is about getting yourself back. It's about finally getting to ask, for the first time maybe, wait, what do I want? And actually learning to trust your own gut. It's also about making a very conscious choice to break a generational cycle, to refuse to pass on the hurt, and instead to learn how to parent yourself with the kindness you might never have received.
Look, when it comes down to it, making this decision isn't about being heartless. It's about profound self-preservation. It just means you finally stopped walking back into the fire simply because someone told you that you're supposed to. It means you chose peace over chaos, and that is an incredibly brave thing to do.
So, what's the one thing to take away from all of this? It's this. You are absolutely allowed to grieve what you lost and still build the life you deserve. And if any of this, any of it at all, sounds familiar to you, please know you are not alone. There are so many people walking the same quiet, complicated, and courageous path toward healing.